Welcome to another NASAGA podcast. My name is Sonya Wolfram, a volunteer content creator for NASAGA. I'm involved in the games community, including local Seattle serious and social impact games meetup, and also in the indie and AAA space. I am here today with Nick Wolfram to talk about designed and emergent narrative in games.
Hi.
Hi, Nick. A little background. Nick and I have been married for almost 3 years, and Nick has been involved in narrative, technical writing, editing, and copywriting in the indie and AAA space for a number of years, and has also been collecting games since he was a young boy. So I felt this was a fantastic topic for us to discuss today. Nick, welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about your narrative background?
Yeah, it's good to be here. I've been a narrative consultant for a few different ongoing projects for a while now, including comic books, video games, and novels. Additionally, whenever I play a game or watch a movie or really experience any narrative, I have an innate habit of dissecting and analyzing all of it. And I'll pretty much seek out anybody who's gone through the same thing, watched the same movie, played the same game, and try to talk about it and just talk through it with them. So I tend to be very analytical about narrative and think about, what I like, why I feel that way, what I dislike, and what makes it good or bad, in my opinion.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for being here. First off, before we get started, if you haven't checked out the past podcasts NASAGA has done, including the one with Mark Chen on narrative, where they touch on narrative in gamification, arbitrary narrative, impacts of new technology, etc., I encourage our listeners to please take a look at those on our website. So, Nick, let's start off with the discussion about our ideas of what it means to be or have designed narrative versus something a little bit more emergent in a game. How would you define those two types of narrative?
Well, just about every game we know and love follows a very deliberate, structured design narrative. Everything from most Zelda games to Final Fantasy to Uncharted, even fighting games like Street Fighter, they all follow the same style of narrative presentation that we see in other storytelling media, like film, comic books, novels, just about anything that has a story. There is a set story and a specific way in which the artist wants their audience to experience it. On the other hand, we have a much smaller selection of games with an emergent narrative, where the player's decisions have a much more significant impact on the flow that the narrative takes. One extreme example of this that most people are going to be familiar with is The Sims, in which there's not really a set story at all, but a story can emerge based on how a player manages their family or neighborhood or other aspects of the fake life that they're creating within the game. And other games from Will Wright in that same kind of vein also tend to have an emergent narrative where the storytelling is left entirely up to the player.
So do you feel like this could be more of a spectrum? So I'm kind of imagining maybe design narrative on the left and emergent narrative on the right. And if you do believe that, do you feel like there are genres that typically skew from one side to the other?
Yeah, I'd say it's absolutely a spectrum. I mean, most games fall somewhere in the middle, although more toward on the design narrative side of things. Pretty much extreme toward the design narrative, but still somewhere in the middle. And in that case, the story is pretty much on rails, and the player is just kind of driving it forward as they play through the game. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, there's games like The Sims, where there isn't any story, but we are able to create a story using the game. One of the games that I like to say falls more in between is something like Mass Effect, where the story itself is pre-designed, and while there are a few choices the player can make that will influence aspects of the outcome and aspects of the direction that the story takes, it's still pretty much all predetermined. But the main character themselves starts off as kind of a blank slate, and leaves it up to the player to define how Commander Shepard is, what their personality is like, even what their history is like, if that's what they're interested in. And then there are other games, like Twine games, where the story is still on rails, more or less, but because it's a highly branching narrative and there's lots of different specific choices that the players can make, the player at least gets to select which rails the story goes on to. And so it's a little bit more emergent in that sense, in that the story could be different every time you play through the game, depending on the choices you make. But it's still designed deliberately by the designers.
So it kind of sounds like you're talking about player agency there. How does player agency play into these definitions?
I mean, it's completely based on player agency. An emergent narrative means that the developers are essentially handing over the reins of the narrative to the player and asking them to drive it themselves, as opposed to a normal game in which the developers are driving the narrative and the player is really just piloting the car along the predefined rails.
Similar to a movie, you would say.
Yes, but with a pilot. However, the more agency developers give the player, the more emergent the narrative becomes. The closer to the extreme side of emergent narrative we get, the more it becomes clear that developers aren't really building a narrative as much as they are building a toolbox for someone else to construct a narrative. Generally, the player. The toolbox can really define any number of aspects of the story, such as characters, setting, beginning, ending, tone, or any aspect, and then leave the rest up to the player. And it's pretty important to get this toolbox right, because the more it defines, the more it starts edging toward a structured narrative. But the less it defines, the more it edges to too many possibilities. For example, if you were to just give somebody a blank notebook and tell them to write you a story, that's almost crippling with the number of choices that you could make and just being put on the spot right there. But if you hand someone a blank notebook and say, hey, I need a story set in 18th century London focused on horror, maybe containing werewolves, if you like that, then the writer has a much clearer direction to go. And even though it's an extremely open prompt and an extremely open toolbox that you've given them, they still have a clearer direction, and it still is a toolbox.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So let's try to dive into some examples. I personally feel it's very easy to find examples of designed narrative, especially in the entertainment realm of games. But for the sake of consistency, are there any examples of design narrative outside of entertainment where the overarching goal is only to tell a story and not necessarily a focus on the mechanics?
I mean, when you say a game that's really just there to tell a story and not focused on the mechanics, visual novels are obviously going to immediately come to mind. Although it is a little controversial because some people try to argue that visual novels may not necessarily be games. I think that's kind of a non-argument. They offer player choices, and so as far as I'm concerned, they are at least past the minimum to being a game. But the gameplay really only manifests itself as presenting players' choices, or literally deciding which direction they want to take the story. But those choices are usually enough to get the player emotionally invested in the story and feel responsible for the decisions they've made, which it can make it for a very engaging and emotional experience. They're not really focused on the actual gameplay, but they're focused on creating an emotional experience for the player. That's not necessarily entertaining, because, feeling sad or depressed isn't necessarily entertainment all the time. But outside of that, there's also games like Dear Esther or To the Moon, which are heavily narrative focused and offer very little in the ways of gameplay, but try to make up for that by having an engaging story, obviously to different quality levels of results.
Yeah, To the Moon is definitely on my list to play, so we'll have to have a discussion about that afterward. So what about emergent narrative? Have you found any examples that do this well?
I mean, yeah, just leaving the video game world for a second and going back to the early 1970s. That's when we saw Dungeons and Dragons into the world for the first time, and really that was one of the earliest modern examples of an emergent narrative toolbox. All of the player guides, the monster books, the dungeon guides, pretty much any handbook for D&D is part of the toolbox for D&D, where they give you information on monster statistics, what spells you can use, what items are available in the game, what the settings are like, what the geography is like of these imaginary worlds. Like, really, this is just a very robust toolbox that the dungeon master can use however they like. If they want to tell a grand sweeping story of people traversing the entire world of Dungeons and Dragons and saving it from a global threat, that's something they can do. If they want to tell a smaller individual story that takes place over the course of one night at an inn, that's also something they can do. It's a very robust toolbox. But really, that's what it is it's a toolbox. And there have been a lot of other tabletop games that have come out in that vein ever since then, obviously. Pretty much any setting you can think of has had some structure introduced for the world to host their own pen and paper RPGs in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say that was kind of the advent of emergent narrative as most people know it. One of the more recent examples in video games that I think is pretty interesting, that is kind of emergent narrative, but is also about the illusion of emergent narrative, is the Stanley Parable, which, if you're not familiar with it, has a narrator who is discussing the activities of the player's avatar Stanley as he goes through just an average day in his life. And the narrator might say something like, Stanley goes through the door on the right. And then the player can obviously go through the door on the right, but since it's a video game, they can also go through the door on the left, thinking they're kind of being clever and going against the flow of the narrative. But as the player goes through and makes more and more choices, they begin to realize that they aren't really making any choices. They're just kind of selecting a different direction for the narrative to go. And really, the designers have already thought of all the different choices that they could make. And so the players are just kind of still in this box that the designers have made of a very structured narrative. It's just highly branching, and the more choices they make, the more you realize you don't have very many choices to make, and you aren't really making any at all.
So it's more of a commentary on emergent narrative rather than actual, extreme emergent narrative itself, you would say?
In a sense, yeah. I mean, it's closer to a commentary on player agency, which does more or less make it into a commentary on emergent narrative because of how closely tied they are.
I feel like Undertale has also been kind of that as well. It's more of a commentary about the choices that you decided to make, and then it gives you a sort of a different ending based on that.
Yeah, Undertale is a little bit more of a meta commentary on the assumptions that we make as we go into games, and the assumption of like what a monster is and why we're actually fighting all these monsters. But it is a similar sense in that it's a very meta analysis of how we accept narrative in games.
Yeah. Do you feel like either one of these types of storytelling is more effective at engaging players, or is it more of a tool that supports the goal of the game instead?
In a sense of emergent narrative versus design narrative?
Yeah.
I mean, it really depends on the game and the game's appeal. But I feel that the best role of video games in the world of narrative lies somewhere in between the two. As far as other traditional storytelling methods, you really only have the choice to go for a very deliberate designed narrative. There are a few creative exceptions you can make, but without some level of interaction from your audience, you're not going to be able to develop much of an emergent narrative because nobody's going to be able to drive it but you. And since video games are a highly interactive medium, obviously, we have the unique opportunity to deliver an emergent narrative.
Mm.
And that's why I think the best place we can go is someplace in between these, where we see a highly dynamic story develop based on players' choices. Sometimes, some of my favorite narrative experiences have been from games with set narratives, but the way that the game develops presents the narrative in a dynamic way. Her Story is a great example of this, where the story is completely set. It's 100% based on real life filmed footage of one actress, and she's acting out a bunch of different bite-sized scenes. And as the player goes through these scenes, they're going to go through the scenes in a completely different order from every other player that plays the game, just by the way that the game is designed. And so they might find out certain plot twists earlier, but really, it's hard to get the full scope of the narrative until you get close to the end. And so most players will have that full scope around the same time, but their path to discovering the full scope is going to be very different, and it's kind of a cool sign in that sense.
Yeah.
There's also the games from director Hidetaka Miyazaki, who directed Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Demon Souls, and a couple other games before that. Well, I think just one game before Demon Souls, and Dark Souls 3. And his approach to narrative is very atypical from what we've seen in games. His methods revolve around kind of environmental cues, item placement and descriptions, and enemy location. Pretty much the entire way the world is structured and populated is his given way of telling a story. And since the progression through these games is very non-linear, each player kind of discovers aspects of the story in a different way and pieces things together shortly, but or in a different way, I guess. But it's really hard for any one player to get the full picture by themselves. And so it also fostered this great sense of community where people had to come together and bring their pieces of the story that they had collected and try to see how everything fits on the big picture.
Did you feel like those series wouldn't have been successful, or maybe the narrative wouldn't have been as wholesome if the community wasn't available, like at the fingertips of, modern, having an internet connection and all that type of stuff?
I don't know if I'd say that the games wouldn't have been successful, because it's really the strong gameplay backbone that's built into those games that makes them successful, and is really what makes players stay around past the beginning of the game. But I would say that the narrative is what's kept the games feeling fresh, and a big part of what's kept the community engaged in the game now that it's almost 6 years after the original Dark Souls came out. It's still a highly active community. People are still discussing the stories. I think obviously there have been 2 sequels, but I do think that that would still be the case even if there hadn't been those sequels. And I do think that having that community and having these people connected to discuss the story was absolutely integral to making the story engaging. And it's a kind of story that wouldn't have worked without this kind of global community that we can have now.
So a tool in their toolbox, then.
I suppose so.
Yeah. Do you feel the social... So kind of shifting gears a little bit more toward, social and community and society and things like that. One of the things I like to focus on is the impact that games could potentially have on society. And I like to call them social impact games. Do you feel like those types of games, the games that were made for something other than entertainment and wanted to make an impact on society, do you feel that those types of games you've played so far do a good job of either one or the other narrative, so either designed or emergent narrative? And if not, how can social impact games use either emergent or designed narrative more effectively to keep players engaged?
I think a lot of the art house games have done a good job of this, but some of the other games on the scene have not done a particularly impressive job, in my opinion. A lot of those games, the developers behind them get so involved in delivering the message that they want to get out to the world behind the games that they kind of lose sight of engaging game design. And I do think the emergent narrative is going to be key to part of that engaging game design where the player feels like they're a part of the development of this work rather than just a passive audience who's happens to be driving it forward. However, some of those engaging art games do carry themes and messages that make them a lot more socially impactful. And I would say those games do an excellent job of keeping players engaged. This War of Mine comes to mind. Papers, Please immediately comes to mind. And the heavily branching narrative structure of that game and the many choices therein offer a strong balance of emergent and structured narrative that, I mean, from my experience, really leaves the player feeling directly responsible for the consequences of their choices as they try to balance their character's home life with their professional life, with their obligation to their government. And honestly, a lot of these consequences can be really negative, and it's hard to borderline impossible to get a positive outcome, and it really weighs on you as a player as you feel the responsibility because these were decisions that you actually made during the game.
So it looks like we're running short on time. I think we can wrap it up with one final question. Where do you see the future of storytelling going in the next 10 to 20 years for games?
You know, it's hard to say without knowing what is on the horizon. The games I just mentioned a few minutes ago, Dark Souls and Bloodborne, have done an excellent job of advancing narrative in games by leagues almost instantaneously. And I think we've already seen the impact of those come through in a lot of different places. Very recently, the newest Zelda game, Breath of the Wild, borrows heavily from the narrative design philosophy of those games, in which everything is kind of environmental. You know, when you find a dilapidated building or a village ruins, it kind of tells a story in of itself, and you get more of a picture of the world that you're interacting with, of the world that you're in, and the history of it, and how you arrived where you are right now. And I think that kind of minimalist storytelling, where the player gets as much or as little of the story as they want while they play through the game, is a big advent that I'm very excited to see more of. But honestly, somebody else could innovate something completely new, and if I knew what that was, then I'd probably be out making it myself right now. Mm-hmm. But I look forward to the future of narrative as this continues to develop, because obviously, I mean, Dark Souls and Demon Souls only came out within the past 7 years. So there's a lot more ground to cover, and I think we'll see what that is.
Especially with VR and AR and those types of things, there's probably a lot left to explore with emergent narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. As the technology develops, we're seeing more and more new things that can happen in games, and developers are really able to take a handle on it. I mean, I was just watching the video about the development of Breath of the Wild that Nintendo put out, and they said that they wanted to do a lot of these concepts in Wind Waker about 14 years ago, and they couldn't because of restrictions from the technology. But now they can, and so who knows how much more technology and advancements will help us. And I mean, VR is definitely a big one on the horizon, and AR as well. Yeah.
Well, that is it for our podcast. Nick, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to have plenty more conversations in the future about these types of games, and especially about narrative. So I'd love to have you back.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
For the audience, you can search NASAGA.org on Facebook and like our page to follow some more content that we'll be posting in the future. You can also check out the rest of our podcasts and blog posts on the interesting topics we've covered thus far on our actual website, nasaga.org. If you have any ideas for topics to cover or want to comment on some of the content that we've already done, please reach out to us on social media. Nick, thanks again so much for the conversation, and I look forward to having a future one with you.
Yeah, we'll talk to you guys later.
All right. Bye, everyone.